Hi everybody. I'm going to give you a little bit of advice about problems 7 and 8 from the brute force homework. In both problems, you have to loop over all pairs of values in an array. When people had trouble with this in class, I recommended that you do what you should always do when you're having trouble coming up with an algorithm, is you should run a small example yourself by hand. So let's do this one really quickly. If I want to visit all pairs of values in this array, I want to be sure I'm not going to miss any, so I need a systematic approach for doing this. So I think a systematic approach that makes sense to me is I'm going to start with the first thing, and I'm going to match it with all of the other things. So I'm going to match A with B, and then with C, and then with D, and then with E. Now I'm sure that I've matched A with everything, so I can move on to B. Alright, so I'm going to take B. I don't need to match it with A, because I've already done that here. So I'm going to take B and match it with C, and then D, and then E. And I can do the same thing with C now. I'll take C and match it with D and E. And then the last thing I need to do is match D with E, and I'm done. So the whole trick is take this process, this systematic approach that we just did, and figure out how to write it down as an algorithm. So I know that if I'm accessing array elements, I have to think in terms of the indices. So let's pay attention to what was I doing here, like which indices was I visiting. It seems like I always have a first value and a second value. And it looks like I start with my first value at location 0. And while my first location is 0, my second value goes from indices 1 to 4. Now, my first index, I make it go up by 1. So my first index is 1. And while my first index is 1, my second index goes from, it looks like, location 2 to 4. And then I increase my first index by another 1. So now I'm at index 2. And the second index starts at 3 and goes to 4. And then here my first index is at 3, and my second index is just at 4. So this is a way of paying attention to numerically what's happening to the indices. What values are they going through? What's the smallest thing that they visit? What's the largest thing that they visit? And now I hope it's pretty clear how you could write this down as nested loops. So my first index is going from 0 to 4, and then my second index is always starting at 1 larger than my first index, which makes sense because when I was trying to pair A with everything, I wanted to start with the very next one, with B, so I visited those. Then my first index went up by 1, and my second index reset here, and I visited those. And my first index went up by 1, and my second index reset, and I visited those. So my second index always starts at my first index plus 1, and it ranges up to the end of the array again. So now, on the inside here, you can do whatever you want. If the elements in here were point objects, representing two-dimensional points in space, every single pair I could ask what's the distance between that pair, and then check if it's the largest distance I've seen so far. Or if this was queen objects, I could look at every pair of queen objects and I could ask, is this queen threatening that queen? To see whether or not this arrangement of queens actually satisfies the 8 queens problem. There are 2 questions that you should think about carefully to be sure that you actually understand what's going on here and to practice the ideas. The first question is, what if the second index didn't start here? What if the second index started at 0? So first is going from 0 to 4, and second is going from 0 to 4. I would say take your fingers. Have your left hand finger represent the first index, and your right hand finger represent the second index, and see if you can actually go step by step and have your fingers point at the values that are represented if the computer were actually to run that loop. That's a great way to make sure you actually understand. The second question you should think about is, what if, instead of visiting all pairs of values, I wanted to visit all sets of 3 values? So for example, let's imagine that each element here is a point in 2-dimensional space, and I want to know what are all the possible triangles I could create by drawing 3 of the points from the list. So I want you to loop over all possible triangles. As long as you can answer those 2 questions, I think it's pretty safe to say that you have understood the pattern here.